Today, we're going to try and understand one of the darkest, most complex intelligence services in history. But we're not going to do it with some big, boring overview. Instead, we're going to see it all through the eyes of one man, its chief, Walter Schellenberg. His story, believe it or not, is our guide to understanding how a modern country can literally weaponize ideology itself. So you might think a story like this starts back in the 1940s, right? Well, it doesn't. It starts today, or, well, just last year, in a quiet Canadian cemetery, where a monument was taken down. It was there to honor soldiers from a Ukrainian division that fought under Nazi command. This isn't some dusty old history. It's a raw nerve. It shows that the past is very much alive and still being fought over right now. So the big question is, why? Why does this stuff keep coming up? If we really want to understand why this history is still such a battlefield, we've got to go back to the source. We need to go inside the machinery of the Nazi state, and specifically its most fanatical, ideologically driven intelligence agency. And the person who's going to guide us through this world is the man who ran it, Walter Schellenberg. Now, you might be picturing some kind of thuggish fanatic, but that's not him. This was a university-educated lawyer, a smart guy, just driven by this incredible ambition. And he climbed his way right to the absolute center of power. He is our window into this whole dark world. Okay, let's start at the beginning, with the very foundation of Schellenberg's organization. Because look, to get why it failed so badly and did such horrific things, you first have to wrap your head around its founding principle, which was kind of bonkers. Belief was way more important than competence. So let's get a few of the names straight, because it can get confusing. Schellenberg ran something called Office VI. That was the foreign intelligence part of a much bigger organization called the RSHA. The best way to think of the RSHA is as this giant, terrifying fusion of the state police, we're talking the Gestapo, and the Nazi Party's own security service, the SD. It was basically the nerve center of the entire terror state. And here is the absolute key to the whole thing. The early SD, the organization Schellenberg came from, wasn't out there trying to recruit James Bond. They weren't looking for seasoned spies or brilliant analysts. No, they were recruiting true believers. It was an entire organization built by men who were 100% committed to the Nazi worldview, but often had zero clue about the actual business of espionage. This quote right here just nails the psychology of it all. This vague, all-encompassing ideology, it allowed educated, ambitious guys like Schellenberg to do some serious mental gymnastics. You see, they could grab onto the parts they liked, national pride, making Germany strong again, while just conveniently pushing aside or totally ignoring the brutal, murderous reality of the system they were building. So what happens when you build a spy service on pure ideology instead of, facts? Well, what you get is a total mess. A history of bitter rivalries, completely delusional fantasies, and in the end, just catastrophic failure. Let's take a look at how that actually played out. First off, the Third Reich's intelligence world wasn't some well-oiled machine. It was more like a snake pit of rivals. And this slide really lays out the main fight. On one side, you've got Schellenberg's Office V6. That's the party's ideological spy agency. On the other side is the Abwehr, the army's old-school, traditional intelligence branch. And this wasn't just some friendly competition. Oh, no. It was a vicious turf war, and it totally poisoned their ability to get anything done. And if you want to know just how deep the fantasy went, just get a load of this. This is a real list from a real Office VI report. They were claiming all these powerful Americans as their high-level contacts. I mean, look at this list. Rockefeller, Ford, the vice president, the secretary of state. It is pure, unadulterated wishful thinking. It's like they were living in a fantasy world where everyone who mattered was secretly on their side. And, that kind of fantasy thinking? It leads to some pretty spectacular real-world failures. They were so desperate to prove they were better than the Army's intelligence service that Office VI started sending these missions to the U.S. with just amateur-hour agents. It was so bad that even Schellenberg himself admitted later that missions like Operation Magpie were basically just hopeless Hail Marys, totally doomed from the start, because they just didn't have anyone good to send. Okay, this is where the story takes a much, much darker turn. This mix of fanatical belief and backstabbing ambition didn't just lead to them being bad at their jobs. It led to something so much worse. You see, the story of Schellenberg's intelligence service is completely inseparable from the story of the Holocaust. And you can just watch the horror escalate right on this timeline. It starts in 1938 in Austria. The mission is called Racial Ideological Policing,
a chilling enough phrase on its own. But then, just a year later in Poland, that mission morphs into straight-up murder campaigns. And then comes 1941, the invasion of the Soviet Union. This is the moment their mission becomes outright genocide. And it's exactly here that Schellenberg plays his most direct and most damning role.
Let's be crystal clear about this. The regular German army was a bit squeamish about getting its hands that dirty. So when it came time to negotiate how the mass murder units would operate, Schellenberg was the guy they sent in. He personally hammered out the agreement that gave the Einsatzgruppen, these mobile killing squads, total freedom from any military oversight. He created the bureaucratic loophole that allowed them to go on a rampage and murder over 1 million people. And right here, this is where you really see the kind of man he was. After the war, when he was on trial for his life, he couldn't deny that he wrote the document, so the lawyer in him took over. He twisted the facts, focusing on tiny, insignificant details, like who was in charge of providing gasoline or something, to try and paint a picture that the military was really in charge the whole time. It was this brilliant, absolutely cynical legal trick to shift the blame for mass murder. Which brings us to the final part of our story. Because Walter Schellenberg's most lasting legacy, it wasn't anything he did in espionage. It was in the art of the lie. It was how he managed to rewrite his own dark history after it was all over. You see, his real genius wasn't just in making stuff up. Anyone can do that. No, his special talent was his ability to weave this incredible tapestry, mixing a little bit of fact with a lot of fiction, a half-truth with a full truth, until it was basically impossible to tell what was real anymore. He wasn't just a liar, he was a master of disinformation. And that's what made him so dangerous, even after the war. And you know what? He had a playbook, a clear 4-step guide on how to create what we'd call a usable past. Step 1, and this was critical, make sure you surrender to the Americans or the British, not the Soviets. Step 2, immediately offer them something they want, like valuable intel on Japan. Step 3, the big one, reframe your worst crimes so they sound like they were someone else's fault. And finally, step 4, write your memoirs and paint yourself as just a reasonable guy, a professional who got caught up in a terrible system. And that brings us, boom, right back to where we started. This deliberate, calculated effort by men like Schellenberg to muddy the waters, to create a usable past for themselves, to blur the lines of who was responsible for what, that is precisely why this history is not settled. It's why decades and decades later, a monument in a Canadian cemetery can suddenly become an international incident. The battle over how we remember this stuff is still going on. So I'll leave you with this final thought. When the people who actually committed these crimes get to write their own stories, when they get to shape their own legacies and skillfully manipulate the historical record, what's our job? How do we today fight through that fog of lies to make sure that the truth, in all of its awful, complicated glory, is what we actually remember?